Hello.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sigrun, for the invitation. Yeah, as you mentioned, the title of my presentation is The Politics of Football in China in the PRC, Institutional Change and Political Steering under Xi Jinping. I have to say, when I listen to you now, to your introduction, I think sports in general is quite underestimated, especially when I look at our community of China scholars. There are not many people who are dealing with sports or who consider sports to be a relevant or important topic. And when I look at when I look at the international stage, for example, when we had the Winter Olympics in China, and during the Winter Olympics, there was also Vladimir Putin invited. And there was, for example, a New York Times report that he already mentioned that there will be a war in Ukraine. So we don't know about that, but we see that sometimes sports is also kind of a platform for interaction, not only of politics, but also of business, as we will see, and also societal interactions between politics and the economy, or also the society and societal actors, how they interact with politics. So when I look also on my research and also on this football community or international sports community, I think sport diplomacy, I mean, similar to our uh, uh, science diplomacy approaches, I think sport diplomacy is also kind of an interesting field of study, um, where more researchers get involved. And in Germany, not so much, but if I look in the UK, I think in the UK, more people see the value also by looking at sports and see sports maybe as an example of understanding how politics work, for example, in China. And that's also what I try to do when I had my PhD project. So the presentation today is based basically on my PhD project, which was published as a book with Palgrave Macmillan, and soon a German version will also be published by Springer. Um, and this book, it provides an understanding of Xi Jinping's China, or more precisely Chinese politics through football. It makes a contribution to both international football studies and contemporary China studies. And um, for me, also a very interesting part about the theoretical part, it highlights also the limitations of actor-centered institutionalism and political steering. Today, my presentation, I will focus on the theoretical perspective of political steering. Okay, to give you an overview of my presentation, first I will give you a brief introduction, then present my research framework and tell you why it is relevant. Then I will introduce my theoretical approach and the method that I used, and then apply this perspective to my research topic. And at the end, I will discuss and conclude. So, a very basic academic structure of the presentation. So the starting point of my project was that many scholars uh, in the China studies, they argued that Chinese politics have fundamentally changed under Xi Jinping. And they have observed re-centralization and concentration of policymaking authorities in China, which has reshaped the hierarchical interactions in the Chinese political system. And in this context, some scholars refer to institutional changes towards top-level design. Top-level design is a normative concept used by the Chinese party state to envisage the holistic consideration, assessment, monitoring, and solution of perceived problems. Accordingly, I have formulated my research interest, which is to trace, understand, and explain the hierarchical interactions between Chinese political actors and socioeconomic actors in the policy field of football. To date, no study has examined such interactions in the context of Chinese football. And my research questions are: why and how do Chinese party-state actors try to politically steer Chinese socioeconomic actors in this particular policy field? And are Chinese party-state actors able, or some people say also successful, to steer socioeconomic actors in a top-down manner? But why study Chinese football in the first place? So why is it important? Why is it relevant? I chose this policy field because shortly after Xi Jinping took office in 2012, the reform and development of Chinese football became a relatively high priority for high-ranking party-state actors, especially compared to many other sporting disciplines. Between 2014 and 2016, for example, a comprehensive strategy for the development of Chinese football was launched. And in these official documents, the development of football is seen as an indispensable requirement for building China into what they call a powerful sports nation, which underlines the importance of this particular sport to the Chinese central party state. I use political steering theory as my theoretical approach, and Renate Mainz defines political steering as the deliberate political attempt to steer, guide, or direct parts of society, including the economy. In its original form, it is a rigid top-down perspective, meaning the formally superordinate steering subjects, which are typically the government, the state, or some public authority, they try to steer the behavior of hierarchically subordinate steering objects in order to solve perceived problems. So it's mainly all about the solution of problems and the perception also of problems when it comes to this theory. And political steering attempts are not always successful. That's why Mainz distinguishes between the steering action of actors and the ultimate steering effect. And the steering effect is basically the policy outcome. And when we look at Germany, we see that Gunther Schubert in Tübingen and Björn Alpermann, my colleague in Würzburg, they applied this theoretical perspective already to China, and they distinguish between two hierarchical modes of steering, which I'm interested in. So to this hierarchical interactions. The first one is hard steering, which involves authoritative decision-making by actors that is implemented through command and control, and soft steering, which is understood by Gunther and Björn as a discursive practice that is ultimately meant to lead to self-enforced implementation by the actors. For my study, I chose the deductive part of the so-called explaining outcomes process tracing method, which is a qualitative method, in order to be able to what Mainz considers as causal reconstruction. So to causally reconstruct case-specific empirical observations on the basis of this theoretical approach that I have chosen. And the results, they were then used to review the sufficiency of the theoretical perspective, so of political steering theory that I applied on this topic. And the data are based on mainly on document analysis and 22 expert interviews. I've conducted this research during the COVID pandemic. So most of the interviews were made by Zoom interviews or Teams interviews or WeChat. Some interviews I've also done via WeChat, and also telephone conversations. And how are experts defined? So usually these are elite interviews. Experts are defined by Oliver Tribe in this context, as individuals who have been actively participating in the analyzed interactions, or individuals who have an intrinsic interest in these interactions. Most of my interlocutors were Chinese journalists, sport journalists. The case selection followed the diverse case method, which is based on the idea that the respective cases represent the highest possible or full range of distribution of variables in as diverse context as possible in order to increase the validity of the conclusions. And today I will present only two case studies. So the first one, which is on the overseas investments of Chinese companies. And the last one, the fourth case study, which is on Chinese parents and campus football. So let's begin with the first case study, which is on the overseas investments of Chinese companies. And so the comprehensive football reforms that we had between 2014 and 2017, they were followed or accompanied by increased commercial and financial activities and a high influx of capital into European football markets. And in this presentation, I will focus only on the investments in football clubs, not in the players, also due to time reasons. So Chinese companies, they began to invest heavily in the stakes of European football clubs, such as Atletico Madrid in Spain, the emblematic pair of Inter and AC Milan in Italy, and the City Football Group, which is known for its investment in Manchester City Football Club, but they own also other football clubs around the world. And according to the Financial Times, Chinese companies invested between 2014 and 2017 more than $2.5 billion on European football clubs. So these investments, they have attracted considerable media interest and attention around the world. But why did Chinese companies make these investments? It has been repeatedly reported that these commercial activities are due to Xi Jinping's leadership and his personal dreams for Chinese football. In this context, a statement made by Xi Jinping in 2011, a year before he became General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, has often been cited. Xi stated that he had three wishes for Chinese football: to qualify for a World Cup, to host a World Cup, and eventually to win it. By the way, he means the men's World Cup, not the women's World Cup. We have at the moment the European Championship, the Women's Championship in Switzerland, but when we look at the reform programs in the PRC, we see that men's football is, from the perspective of the Chinese Party state, much more important than women's football. And if you look at Chinese women's football, they have already hosted successfully the FIFA Women's World Cup in 1991 and in 2007. So there is a gender issue involved also here, but that's not the focus of my presentation today. But if you want, we can have also a discussion about this after the presentation. So if we look now at the responses of the Chinese business actors. What did they say? Why they have invested in European football clubs? They have repeatedly stated that they have invested in these international football assets because they believe they are contributing to the realization of Xi Jinping's football dreams. For example, Wang Jianlin, the founder and chairman of Dalian Wonder Group, said that the acquisitions in international football assets will accelerate the realization of Xi Jinping's three dreams. I think it's a good thing that the General Secretary likes football, and it's certainly huge support for the development of our football business. I think it's quite an honorable thing for me to respond to the General Secretary's call. And Wang Jianlin was not the only Chinese business person to respond to this alleged call by from Xi Jinping himself to invest in European football. I argue that in particular, one large-scale investment, the one in City Football Group, had a particular signaling effect on Chinese business actors as it was directly associated with Xi Jinping. So what happened in October 2015, Li Ruigang, the founder and chairman of CMC, China Media Capital, he accompanied Xi Jinping on his state visit to the UK. A few months later, a Chinese consortium led by CMC agreed to pay 400 million US dollars for 13% minority stake in City Football Group. And after the investment was announced, Chinese media representatives stated that Xi Jinping had been an indirect contributor to the deal and had played the role of a super contact person. I argue that such high-profile representations in Chinese media have triggered kind of a chain reaction, encouraging more and more Chinese business actors to invest in international football assets. However, it turned out that these investments were perceived as a problem. They were considered to be non-compliant, so not in line with the expectations, what the Chinese central party state expects. And in December 2016, high-level financial regulators responded in a joint statement by labeling these investments in European football as irrational. Back then, Pang Gongsheng, then deputy governor of the People's Bank of China, Chinese Central Bank, and director of the State Administration of Foreign Exchange. Today, he is the governor at the moment of the People's Bank of China. He stated back then, last year, Chinese companies bought a lot of football clubs overseas. If the acquisitions are good for improving the standard of football in China, then I think it's good. But is that the case? There are a lot of companies that have already high debt ratios in China and then borrow large sums of money to make these acquisitions. There are some that are transferring their assets under the guise of direct investments. So that was considered a big problem back then. And then we had a response by Chinese party state actors. They intervened, and they used hard political steering actions, such as the tightening of capital controls and the conduct of investigations into these companies who invested in international football assets in order to solve this perceived problem. And these hard steering actions had an immediate impact on the investment decisions of Chinese business actors. In July 2017, the Chinese Ministry of Commerce announced that the structure of China's foreign investment continued to be optimized, and irrational foreign investment has been effectively curbed. And according to data released by the MOFCOM, the Chinese investment in culture, sports, and entertainment fell by 82.5% within 6 months and accounted for only about 1% of China's total outward investment. So we see that these top-down interventions, these top-down steering actions can be considered highly successful. from the perspective of the Chinese party state. So let's move on to the next case study, which is on Chinese parents and campus football. So one of the biggest perceived problems for the reform and development of football in China is that despite the huge population in the PRC and the corresponding pool of potential football talent in the country, the actual number of Chinese kids and teenagers who play football on a regular basis is relatively small. The lack of footballing practice reduces the development of talent and also affects the long-term competitiveness of Chinese national teams. That's why the Chinese party state has responded with the so-called campus football program or initiative, which is mainly organized by the Chinese Ministry of Commerce, by the Chinese Ministry of Education, sorry, because it has a unique feature. And this unique feature is that the children and the teenagers are not trained primarily in football clubs, as we know it in Germany and Europe, for example, but in educational establishments such as kindergartens, schools, and universities. And one of the expected outcomes of these policy outcomes is to reduce the heavy workload put on Chinese children by the education system and to improve their health condition in general. So in this respect, there were a number of soft political steering actions that have been taken by central party state actors. For example, football has been integrated into the compulsory content of physical education classes in all primary and secondary schools. So-called schools with campus football characteristics have been established to receive targeted financial and other relevant policy support. And footballers have been given, talented footballers have been given preferential access to certain universities, such as Fudan University, for example, by being partially or even fully exempted from the Gaokao, the national entrance examination in China. However, many Chinese parents, they voiced their strong opposition to these soft political steering measures. They criticized that football entering the compulsory content in PE classes is a one-size-fits-it-all approach, ignoring their children's individual interests and preferences, that the admission incentives to enter universities reinforce and increase rather than reduce the examination-oriented education in China, and also increase the burden placed on their children in the education system. And they have concerns over the safety because of the injury risks. Football is considered a dangerous sport in China. So there's a risk for their children. And they also consider football to be a distraction from the academic pursuits of their children and their corresponding career prospects. In other words, football is often considered as dangerous and simply a waste of time in the highly competitive Chinese society by many Chinese parents. Interestingly, the Chinese party state has responded to these concerns by the parents by introducing, for example, an insurance mechanism for campus football related injuries, and also by discursive practices, so telling good stories about campus football to shape and change public opinion and achieve central party state reform goals and objectives. So these also led to a steering effect. So as of August 2022, over 30,000 schools with campus football characteristics were established, and more than 55 million children received at least one football lesson per week. However, it is unclear to what extent these numbers reflect the actual improvements, for example, in training intensity or the quality of the training. And it also doesn't say anything about the long-term participation in football, which is needed to really develop the talent and also have an impact on the level and the competitiveness of the Chinese national teams. So in the next step, I will discuss the theoretical implications of these interactions. I argue that the rigid top-down approach of political steering theory is no longer tenable. Formally subordinate actors, as we have seen with Chinese parents, they are also able to counter-steer superordinate actors. And this one-sided, rigid top-down perspective of political steering has been rejected and criticized before. That's why political steering theory was subsumed under the concept of governance, and steering became a mode of governance. However, according to Renate Mainz, this transition from top-down steering to multi-level governance has not only revealed some new analytical weaknesses, but also failed to address existing ones. She argues, for example, that this transition has made a clear distinction between the steering subject and the steering object obsolete, and has also not led to the elimination of the underlying problem-solving bias, because from this theoretical approach, from the perspective of this theoretical approach, it is assumed that political actors like governments, or in this case, the Chinese party state, it acts because it wants to solve mainly socioeconomic problems, for example, or societal problems, and not because of, I don't know, power relations or something like that. It's mainly about problem solving. In the absence of convincing explanatory approaches, I propose a reference-dependent revision of this theoretical approach of political steering theory that places the respective action orientations of the actors more prominently at the center of the analysis. Accordingly, I define a political steering action as a behavioral response by an actor aimed at changing the perceived non-compliant behavior of another actor in a particular direction, so that it again conforms to a preconceived normative frame of reference, so a starting point. In other words, with the help of their instrumentalized steering resources, actors attempt to redirect negatively perceived behavior deviations from their norms and expectations in such a way that they again correspond to their respective action orientations. So through this reference-dependent revision, the analytical deficits identified by Mainz can be addressed. So the first one, the distinction between the steering subject and the steering object, it is not blurred or abolished, as Mainz argues, but it rather depends on the interaction setting in which who has deviated from whose given normative frame of reference, and who, in response to that, attempts to minimize or eliminate the perceived negative deviation of who. The second one, political steering actions by actors need not necessarily be limited to a specific normative starting point, such as in this case, to solve a particular problem in order to maximize, for example, the well-being of a group of people, such as the citizens of a country, but it can refer to any action orientation. I argue that the perceived negative deviation from a normative frame of reference is or represents the problem per se. So it's a bit complicated maybe to follow this. I'm not sure if you understand it fully, but think about it as a conditionality and relationality. The actors have a normative preconception, and accordingly, they project some expectations. And if other actors don't comply with these expectations, then in the next step, they react with political steering actions to change their behavior or their action orientations so that there is a fit again. So they reach compliance again with their normative preconceptions. But this has also limitations. This proposed reference-dependent revision has its limitations. First of all, there might be a selection or confirmation bias because political steering theory in general, this approach that I propose, but also the original theoretical approach is based on observable behavioral reactions and interactions. So if there is no reaction, and there might be no reaction also because of strategy calculations, that's, for example, what my colleague in Würzburg analyzes, no steering, which I think is a bit problematic because if there's no response, then we have to be very careful to analyze that there might be a strategic underpinning why they don't respond, for example. I mean, just think about social movement in China and so on. So some actors, they prefer not to respond to certain things, even if they consider it as a problem. Yeah, that's one of the issues, which is, I think, a limitation. So some researchers, they might look at these observable reactions and interactions and select also cases accordingly, but disregard those where there is no, where this mechanism is not in place, where actors, for example, choose not to respond. The second limitation is the absence of the emotional dimension. So political steering theory is very limited in capturing emotions. And as I have seen during my also investigation, during my research, emotions are very important also, and an integral part also of these interactions. And I mean, we could leave them out, but I believe it would be useful, for example, to look at the literature on social psychology or political psychology, which try to integrate these kind of emotions in interactions, and that might be helpful, I think. The third limitation is not so much conceptual, but more based on the history and the contextual specificity of political steering theory, because it originated from Germany, and it originated by analyzing state-affiliated corporatist sectors and liberal democratic contexts in Germany and Europe. So I argue that it might create a conceptual distortion also if we just blindly apply this theoretical perspective on the PRC, especially in the Xi Jinping era. And the last one, but not least, there is a terminological ambiguity of categories like soft and hard steering, because I argue that these are value judgmental categories and also potentially misleading. That's why I propose to differentiate between direct and indirect steering. And direct steering is targeting the behavior of other actors, and indirect steering is targeting the action orientation, so the norms and expectations of other actors. And we didn't talk about these aspects of the theory, but I didn't talk about it in my presentation, but there are also corresponding steering instruments to these modes of steering. So, yeah, I mean, if you have questions in that regard, we can have a discussion about that later on. To conclude, so the first research question, why and how do Chinese party-state actors attempt to politically steer Chinese socioeconomic actors in the policy field of football, can be answered to the effect that Chinese party-state actors, they use these top-down political steering actions to change the deviant behavior of Chinese socioeconomic actors, so the business and societal actors, and bring them back into line with their expectations. And the second research question can be answered with yes and no. Chinese party-state actors, they were able, in all case studies that I conducted, they were able to respond in a top-down manner to these deviant behaviors of other actors. But as we have seen with the Chinese parents, in some cases, only to a limited extent. Okay, that's my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention. If you have no access to my book, just write me an email. I can send it to you. And I'm looking forward to your questions and comments. Thank you.